Singapore's history can be traced back to the beginnings of the global economy and to the ambitions of a maverick British pioneer. He came from a very different world to Lee Kuan Yew, but has left his imprint just as clearly on the modern city. Without him, Singapore would never have begun its remarkable journey. From mangrove to metropolis. Back in the 19th century, the British were developing a powerful trading empire and had their sights set on Southeast Asia. January 1819, a small expeditionary force has arrived on the island, working for the British East India Company. The leader is a highly ambitious, determined young man, an official of the company. His name would become forever linked with Singapore. He is Sir Thomas Stamford Raffles.
He was a man with a vision, ahead of his time perhaps, whereas most of the East India Company officials in this part of the world were basically here for the trade, perhaps for the adventure. Raffles had an idea of changing the world, of making it a better place.
Raffles was fascinated by Singapore's history and carried out an archaeological survey of the island, looking for evidence of its glorious 14th century past. Back then, Singapore was an important island at the center of a thriving Malay kingdom. It was known as Temasek and appears on the earliest Chinese maps of the region.
Raffles realized that there had been a former state here, a former kingdom, and in many respects he wanted to create a new Temasek, a new Singapore that would be guided by the British.
But Raffles had no legal right to do anything on this Malay island without the blessing of a Malay sultan. The local Sultan of Johor had already ruled out making any deals with the British, but he had a disgruntled elder brother, Hussein, with a rival claim to his throne. Raffles realized this and smuggled Hussein into Singapore. Without any authority, he proclaimed him to be the rightful sultan. In effect, Raffles had carried out a coup.
This is where Raffles' understanding of Malay culture, Malay history, Malay text comes into play. He basically created a Sultan of Singapore, in many respects out of thin air.
The port of Singapore is to be considered under the immediate protection.
Having installed his own sultan, Raffles organized a formal handover of power. Hussein was to receive a handsome salary, but in return, Raffles would be able to run the island as he wanted.
This treaty is concluded at Singapore on the 8th day of February in the year of our Lord, 1819.
This historic occasion was witnessed by a few dozen sea gypsies, pirates and fishermen who lived on the island.
My great-grandfather was there. You see, maybe he must be a kid at the time. He didn't understand, but he must have remembered a few things, what he saw. That was the first time somebody saw a white man coming to Singapore. When they were just aghast, I suppose, and they didn't understand the whole thing about that.
With the signing of the treaty, Singapore's history as a Malay island had effectively come to an end.
Company, face the flag!
From now on, it was to be a British settlement in the hands of the East India Company.
Company, salute!
A blank canvas to be shaped by the vision of one man. Nearly 200 years later, a statue of Raffles stands on the spot where he came ashore. But how was this one man going to turn a swamp into a city? The East India Company was producing opium in northern India and shipping it to China, where it was used to buy supplies of tea, which could then be sent back to England. It was the company's most profitable trade route, but every one of its ships had to pass through a narrow passage known as the Malacca Straits. To protect its interests, the company wanted to set up a port somewhere at the foot of the Malacca Straits. But there was a problem. For 200 years, the Dutch had controlled the East Indies. They were the military and economic superpower in the region, and it was company policy to do nothing which might upset them. Raffles' expedition to Singapore was deliberately provocative. He was an official of the company and had been told to tread very carefully. No one expected him to set up a port under the very noses of the Dutch.
Company, salute!
Whenever he talked about furthering British ambitions east of Calcutta, everyone said, let's leave it as it is, don't rock the boat, you know, the Dutch aren't going to like it. And Raffles thought, well, to hell with the Dutch, I like it, and I'm going to do it, and he did.
2 weeks after Raffles raised the British flag over Singapore, news reached his boss, Charles Bannerman, the governor of Penang. Bannerman didn't like or trust the ambitious young Raffles, and was furious that one of his men had breached company policy. He urgently contacted his Dutch counterparts to assure them that Raffles had been acting on his own initiative, without the authority of the company.
He was very effusive and said, very sorry, we'll call the man back. He was quite out of order, and I'm sure you needn't worry about him being there for very long.
Bannerman's assurances stopped the Dutch from invading Singapore. They simply waited for the British to pull out. But Bannerman hadn't accounted for the mood back in London. The recent Napoleonic Wars had seen an upsurge in military pride and a greater sense of national defiance. Rather than giving in to the Dutch over Singapore, word was sent to Bannerman that Raffles should be allowed to stay put.
It was great brouhaha back in Europe. In the end, the dust died down, and after a few years, it was a fait accompli. The Dutch weren't going to do anything about it.
Raffles realized that for Singapore to survive, it needed to be more than a stopover between India and China, and become a port in its own right, attracting trade from across the region. But how could he persuade traders to come to his new settlement?
This whole region was full of traders all over the place. There are many river mouths, small ports. So what Raffles did was to provide them with a place where they could come and trade freely. By providing that service, the word got around very, very quickly, and all these people realized that this was a tremendous advantage. If they brought all their trade to Singapore, they could bring in all kinds of goods, sell almost anything they could get without having to pay taxes, and there was just nothing like that anywhere else in Asia.
This was Raffles' big idea, free trade. It was the bait that would lure traders away from other ports in the region and make Singapore their base.